They called it Ronson, a tank that burned with a spark. But the real story isn't fire. It's the fight to outsmart it. The nickname goes ahead of the tank like a rumor, with a match between its teeth. Sherman Ronson. The syllables carry the metallic click of a lighter and the hiss of a flame that never learns restraint. On training grounds, the word becomes a joke with bad manners. At the edge of hedgerows, it turns into a spell men are afraid to pronounce. Fire is the battlefield's oldest jurist, impartial and immediate, and crews know its verdict arrives faster than any officer's. Armor offers courage the way a roof offers weather. Once a spark is inside, walls become accomplices. You have heard the accusation that this machine, conceived in practicality and shipped by the thousands, was predisposed to burn at the slightest insult. Lighting every time, first time, as if a brand were a prophecy. But brands are commerce, and war is chemistry, and the truth lives in the narrow corridor where metal meets habit. The archetypes are waiting. Fire as devourer, steel as second skin, speed as denial, courage as a borrowed loan. Across the years, the same figures step onto the stage. The driver whose hands measure fear through the clutch. The bow gunner who hoards humor like rations. The gunner who keeps time with the reticle. The loader who learns the weight and temperature of hope. The commander whose periscope is a reluctant third eye. Their house of work is a welded sermon on compromise height traded for depression, numbers for pedigree, reliability for glamour. In the quiet before dawn's gray exposes every lie. A Sherman breathes in petrol the way a church breathes in incense, and myth crouches outside the hatch with a stopwatch. The first lesson belongs to propellant, not to gasoline. Inside the turret ring, cartridges are small promises waiting their turn, each packed with a powder that only pretends to be patient. Early racks line the sponsons like pantry shelves along the hull sides, neat arrays beside the crew's shoulders, whitened by the chalky sweat of cordite and nitrocellulose. A penetrating jet or a jagged shard does not need to find the tank's heart. It needs only to find the pantry. Then a tidy interior becomes a hearth. Flames taste paint, rubber seals, oil-soaked rags, the canvas of a map, and the exits. The brand name makes a cruel metaphor of this chemistry, and men who are not inside the act will believe the metaphor explains everything. In North Africa, the sun makes mirage into doctrine, and the first brew-ups acquire their reputation. A tank hit at Gazala coughs black into a sky that already smells of tar and engine breath. Another near Taburba turns into white pillars, propellant burning cleanly, as if ashamed of its own color. In those early seasons, the wrecks advertise certainty that a hit means a hearth, that hatches are doors that shrink under heat, that the margin between a crew and a statistic can be measured in seconds, and seconds were not issued in abundance. You, looking back, want to call design guilty and close the case. Yet the same theater teaches a quieter arithmetic. Panzer IIIs and APHEs burn when their own propellant catches. Early T-34s flash when fuel lines surrender. Everything mortal wears tinder in some seam. Fire plays no favorites. It simply obeys the laws of air and angle. Armor learns, slowly at first and then with the urgency of bruised memory. The deliberate mind moves ammunition out of the walls and down into armored bins, lidded and inset, encircled with jackets of water and glycol that turn every cartridge into a baptized citizen. Wet stowage, they call it, an unpoetic name for an intimate insurance water for powder, anti-freeze for morale, a humble moat around each brass cylinder. Numbers, those reluctant saints, begin to tell a different gospel. The chance that a struck hull brews up falls from a cruel frequent word to an occasional grim one. From something like 2 in 3 to something like 1 in 10 when the new bins arrive and the loaders relearn their routes. The lighter's jingle grows quieter. Myth hates data but cannot smother it entirely. Fuel becomes the red herring soldiers love to argue over. Gasoline. Diesel men swear by their noses and the stories of uncles. Yet crews who have watched flame learn a more boring truth. It is the powders and the packed shells, not the petrol in the belly, that decide whether heat becomes verdict. Fuel burns with the slow sulk of a hearth if unpressurized and denied air. Propellant detonates its opinions. A Sherman's heart drinks gasoline without apology and will keep running on a diet of dust and superstition when finer engines sulk. That appetite does not sentence the crew when the first hot tooth bites the armor. It is the pantry, not the tank's drink. That makes the difference between smoke that can be escaped and smoke that refuses to negotiate. War adds instruments to the orchestra of danger. Panzerfausts take their handheld theology into narrow lanes, speaking shapely syllables of copper-line chemistry that turn armor into petals and spawn into swarms. High-velocity guns trade time for certainty. A long 75 or 88 inches is philosophy through air, and the entry wound is modest while the exit, if there is one, is a biography written in a hurry. Even a lucky tilt of metal can betray a crew, sending splinters ricocheting like enraged bees through the vestibule of habit where the loader's elbow had just been. The same stories happen inside Panthers and IVs and T-34s. Different words are used to soften the blow. Only the brand name nickname travels well. Inside the turret, procedure is creed. Bailout drills are rehearsed until muscle takes custody of survival. The commander works the roof latch with the left hand, while the right still grips habit. The gunner slides backward into darkness, where ankles and spent casings argue. The loader knows his place in the choreography of absence. These men learn that 5 seconds is a poem that must rhyme, or the stanza ends. They practice with smoke candles and blunt courage, and discover that panic has the consistency of oil widespread. Slick, survivable if you keep a grip. A machine that remembered to keep its ammunition in baptized bins gives them 6 seconds instead of 4. And those 2 spare syllables become years later in kitchens, in garages, in the weight of a baby, in the smell of a storm about to arrive. The nickname survives because smoke photographs better than probability. Normandy hedgerows turn lanes into flues. The first days after D-Day are an education written in bocage and surprise. Ambush distance is a room's length. Hits come sideways. Vengeful, the tall silhouette becomes an indictment at close range. Houses burn, orchards smolder, and the camera favors the column of flame that solves every argument. Men coming home describe what their eyes could not forget, and the brand sidles into memory like a jingle glued to a headline. Yet the record keeps insisting in its quiet pencil that by the time the Army has changed its bins and rituals, the story is different. Crews punch out of wrecks that would have been coffins. Vehicles are recovered, patched, returned. Fire is a frequent visitor turned an occasional thief. You stand with the argument in your hands and feel its heat. On one side sits the comfort of a single, damning phrase. On the other, the awkward, anti-theatrical truth that engineering and habit revised fate in the middle of the war. That the lighter's laugh belongs mostly to an early chapter. Steel did not become safe, it never does, but it learned restraint at the same moment the men inside learned haste. Both adjustments made a corridor through which lives could run. The tank itself remains an everyman among machines, workmanlike, generous. Neither genius nor fool, it carries enough shells to be believed, enough fuel to be trusted, enough replaceable parts to shrug off a week's bad luck. Its virtues are the kind that never win parades: readiness, obedience to maintenance, a tolerance for mud, a fondness for roads others dislike, a willingness to accept a new turret when one is offered, and a new task when maps change their verbs. The myth resents such ordinary heroism. Ordinary is hard to sell. Yet ordinary is what keeps columns moving after thunder has made men deaf to themselves. If you demand a verdict, the field hands you only a scale. On the pan of fire sits the early arrangement of shells. The side racks like aquariums waiting for a thrown stone. The hedge ambushes. The close-range Fausts speaking theology at the worst distance. The photographs that taught relatives to fear what they could not prevent. On the pan of water sits the later discipline, the bins in the floor, and their cool sleeves. The loaders who would rather curse than leave cartridges out of place. The ordnance officers who pestered crews with diagrams and came back with statistics. The commanders who declared that a neat interior was a rumor of survival. The balance does not erase the scorch marks on the old stories. It explains why newer stories smell more of Cordite's clean burn than of everything else catching. In the end, fire remains the oldest enemy and the oldest ally. It cooks and it consoles. It signals and it scours. Crews do not hate fire. They hate when it is indoors. A tank that learns to keep its hearth where it belongs is not brave. It is considerate. Men who trust their machine enough to rest a palm on its hot engine deck while watching another column pass are not naive. They are beneficiaries of other men's adjustments. The nickname will never retire. It is too sharp, too quick, too portable, but it will share space with a quieter title. Earned in the damp inside the bins, not Ronson, but rescued. The proof sits in steel and behavior, never in slogans. In a Normandy orchard where apples have learned to wear dust, a column takes a hedgerow corner and faces the kind of lesson only close country can teach. A shaped charge whispers from 30 yards, intimate as a confession. Copper turns to liquid and then to needle. Spall flicks through the turret like hornets with a grudge. The loader feels a hot bee kiss his sleeve and remembers to keep the ready round in its lidded cradle. Not across his knees as convenience had begged. The commander slaps the roof latch and bargains 3 breaths out of the day. Behind them, a cousin tank lives because the floor bins did what they were designed to do: swallow heat and return only steam and indignation. In the recovery yard that night, a bored sergeant leans into a hull and points to the blackened lids of a wet stowage chest, scorched but intact, then to the untouched rounds below. Nobody writes a poem for hinges that did their job, but 3 men will grow old because they did. Habit can betray as surely as armor can save. In Italy's terraces, where the stone seems to argue back, a loader stacks 2 extra rounds under the turret basket for a morning that felt thin on ammunition. When the hit comes, it finds not the official bins, but the unofficial enthusiasm. Brass splits, powder inhales air, and heat inherits the interior. The crew punches out and curses themselves from the ditch. No fire burned a reputation faster than this human impatience, undoing engineering caution. Later, ordnance men write memos with polite bile ready racks only. Lids closed, bins wet and counted, nothing loose that can become a fuse. The doctrine is dull and therefore holy. Other machines burn with their own biographies. A Panzerfaust, struck in the sponson where its own propellant sleeps, becomes a chapel of orange. A panther, proud nose tilted, leaks flame through turret seams like a gentleman refusing to weep. A T-34 smolders from somewhere nobody can see until the first hatch opens and oxygen writes its favorite ending. Crews in every language learn to fear the color that turns lungs into opinions they did not intend. The nickname on one machine is only the most portable of insults. Fire does not care about national pride. It cares about where the ammunition sits and what air is available when metal opens a door. Crews learn that inside each machine lives a parliament of flammables. Upholstery that seemed harmless under sunshine becomes a treacherous wick. Lubricants that made traverse sweet volunteer to become accelerant when shards slice bottles and spray. Hydraulic oils, some less flammable than others. All more flammable than hope mist into the air and wait for a Sparks campaign speech. After action, the checklist grows: cloth covers soaked and wrung, rags banished, loose stowage shamed into order. A portable extinguisher moved where a panicked hand will find it blind. Extinguishers spit chemicals that make throats hate their owners. But hate is better than heat. A tank that smells of solvent has made an adult decision. The silhouette has its say. Height is a charity extended to eyes and a tax paid to ambush. In Bocage country, the tall roof that lets a commander read the hedgerow also invites a Faust to choose its paragraph. Crews chain spare track to the flanks. Weld on applique where the sponson once nursed ammo. Stack sandbags with the zeal of men tempted by superstition. Engineers nod at the extra plates over old racks and frown at the sandbags that break suspensions and promise more than physics will confirm. Logs are lashed not as armor, but as negotiation with mud. Each add-on, each talisman, speaks of a single desire to buy 1 more second after the hit, the coin with which all narratives are minted. Variants bicker like cousins at a wake. One hull drinks gasoline and runs like a farmhand who refuses to die. Another hums diesel and smugly accepts the myth that it is safer because it smells less like a filling station. At the moment of penetration, the difference is minor compared to where the shells sleep and whether lids are shut. In the Pacific, where satchel charges and lunge mines argue inches instead of yards, the issue is not Ronson but ritual infantry married to armor by rope and hand signal. Flamethrowers answering caves before caves answer crews. Hatches cracked for air, but not for invitation. In the Ardennes, where the air itself freezes malice, powder burns with a different mood and smoke lies close to the ground, cruel in another register. Fire is Catholic in its patience. It meets every theater in the language that theater speaks. There is a genealogy to caution. Early hulls in Tunisia and Sicily carry ammunition in the walls. Welders arrive with plates like bandages, applique patches over the ribs where cartridges once gleamed a little too close to air. Later hulls are born with the lesson-integrated wet stowage in the belly, lidded bins with gasketed lips, fewer rounds but more probabilities, turret bustle reshuffled, pistol ports deleted or restored according to the latest theology of fragments. Ready racks redesigned so that readiness is not an invitation to grief. Workshops tell crews the new numbers with the pride of accountants. A hit is no longer a convinced flame. It is an argument whose outcome can be steered by behavior. Fire's reputation survives because grief is louder than statistics. A column in a Norman lane takes 3 losses in a minute, and a farmhouse remembers the color of the sky forever. The men who live will forever call their machine by a name that helps the survivors explain the silence of the missing. This is not false. It is incomplete. Later, the same company, with the same machines but different habits, will be hit and smolder rather than bloom, will be trailered out by an ARV that grunts like a forgiving mule. We'll see the same hull remounted with a new gun, a new coat of paint, and a suspicion that luck can be improved. A reputation set by the first season does not admit easily the changes the second season made. There is a choreography to saving one another that no myth honors. A tank halts with smoke inside. A sister hull noses up and blocks the view of the German hedgerow, like an animal offering its flank without ceremony. A corporal from the infantry slams a spare extinguisher through a hatch and shouts the one word that matters out. Someone throws a tarp over the turret ring to smother the breath fire needs. Someone else drags a crewman by his boot heels until curses return, and curses mean oxygen. Later, on the far side of the lane, the same tank that played wall will go belly down over a culvert to help a bridge layer. Debts circulate like blood. Numbers and tinkering made this possible. So did culture. Even the language of the crews changes. In the early years, they speak about hits as if fate kept a diary. Later, they talk about causes, angle, distance, lid, rack, drill, as if causality had finally paid attention. The commander who used to say, "If we're hit, we're done," now says, "If we're hit, do the work." The loader, once the most superstitious man aboard, becomes the priest of latches. The driver times his bailout the way he once timed a clutch. Fingers remembering the lip of a hatch the way they once remembered the resistance of mud. Courage remains, but it moves from theater to craft. The shape of bravery changes from shouting to method. There are rumors that never die. Germans joking about Tommy cookers, British muttering Ronson, Americans telling one another to sit on their helmets when the first round hits to spare themselves a lesson in spell. Each phrase is a talisman against complicated reality. You keep the phrases because they fit in a pocket and are easy to carry. Meanwhile, a supply officer with the charisma of sand insists on spare gaskets for wet bins and takes away a squadron's excuse to leave lids ajar. Meanwhile, a captain who watched a cousin brew in 42 forces his men in 44 to run extraction drills until muscles outvote fear. Myth shrugs, ritual saves. Sometimes the fire arrives not from penetration, but from the mundane cruelty of travel. A backfire in tall grass licks into a drive sprocket smeared with oil. A cigarette spark illegal. Delicious finds a rag that was faithful to a gearbox and becomes an unfaithful wick. The extinguisher answers with a toxic hiss, and men cough and laugh because surviving stupidity is a good rehearsal for surviving everything else. Later, the same crew will be spared by a wet bin when a shell claws the side and dies disappointed. Life comes in both currencies, and it is indecent to count only one. And there is always the war of photographs. In albums, wrecks outnumber runners because wrecks sat still for the lens, and runners were busy at work the camera could not keep up with. Flames speak a language film loves. Steam does not. A tank recovered, repainted, returned to duty has fewer admirers than a tank burned to sculpture. The archive teaches a bias, and history repeats it. Yet ask the men whose palms know the chill of lifting a lid from a wet chest and finding the round still dignified. And they will tell you that the best story is the one that left the least mark. If you seek justice, you will not find it in nicknames. You will find it in numbers written by grudging clerks, in field mods welded by men with poor sleep and good hearts, in drills that shortened panic, in lids that turned a minute into 3. Fire kept its crown. It always does. But the kingdom narrowed. Courage stopped being a wager and became a craft. The lighter's click still echoes in museums and memoir titles, and it deserves a hearing once. Then let the other sound have a turn, water sloshing behind steel, a lid thudding closed, a breath being found. That is the quieter reputation, earned not by myth, but by the boring heroism that lives long enough to be forgotten. They called it MSHA in the East, a soft syllable that rounded the hard edges of steel. On a river that pretended to be a road ice planked with brush, creaking with opinions, a Soviet crew coaxed an M4 across, while breath made small ghosts in the turret. Diesel climbed into the morning like a sour hymn, and rumor ran with it, this one burns less. This one is stubborn in a kinder way. Yet the loader, cheeks raw from the cold, still kept his hands on lidded bins. The gunner still checked the ready rack like a priest patting the reliquary. The engine's drink had changed, but the interior truth had not propellant decided whether a wound became a funeral. In that theater, where Molotovs splashed more theater than decisive physics, and where German shells carried their own small volcanoes inside, the APHE's fate resembled every tank's live if the pantry is disciplined. Die if heat meets powder without a chaperone. The nickname never traveled well in Russian, but fire's language was fluent everywhere. On a hedge-dented lane in Normandy, a British crew nursed a firefly through the green, a long barrel that announced its own ambition. The 17-pounder spoke with the bright authority of velocity, its shells long as arguments and twice as fussy. Inside, the loader became a contortionist philosopher, learning the parable of leverage and recoil while his shoulders remembered every rivet head. Many of these conversions grew from older hulls whose ammunition had once lived in the walls, and you could feel history breathing behind the applique plates that covered yesterday's bad ideas. The radio now lived in a bustle, but the past still haunted the sponsons. A careless round left out for convenience could write disaster in fluent chemistry. The crew made liturgy out of lids close. Latch. Check. Close. Latch. Check. When an ambush found them, and a Faust blew its copper sermon against the flank, flame licked paint and canvas and died sulky on steel that refused to feed it. The loader sat afterward on the glacis with trembling hands and laughed like a man too tired to weep. He had done nothing heroic, only the work. Across an atoll where palms had learned the arithmetic of shrapnel, the Sherman arrived as an accomplice to flame rather than its victim. A bow blister carried the coil, a nozzle crouched where a gun might have been shy, and the tank breathed fire into mouths of coral that had argued for centuries. At 50 meters, the question was not petrol versus diesel. It was whether heat could be persuaded to move in the right direction. Satchel charges and lunge mines spoke at skin distance, and crews learned the habit of hands, infantry glued to fenders. Signals tapped onto armor. Hatches cracked for air and closed for accusation. When a spark found canvas, an extinguisher bit back with a hate that burned throats. When a shell found the old sponson racks on a dry stowage cousin, a brief court was held and sentence arrived. In that theater, the nickname never caught on because the tank's public occupation breathing fire legally took all the syllables available. The private occupation refusing to keep fire indoors was a quieter craft learned the same way everywhere else. Lids, drills, order. The shells themselves carried intent. Some arrived like arguments that refused to end a clean, solid dart that punched and kept moving, leaving only air and terror to finish the job. Others carried small hearts of explosive that preferred to burst inside, converting impact into lightened splinters, fanning sparks across upholstery, oil, and old maps. Phrases such as APHE, APHE, APCBC alphabet soups with emphasis entered the crew's vernacular as emotional weather. They could not choose the enemy's recipe, but they could choose the way their pantry met it. The loader learned to love the dull thud of a lidded bin. The commander learned to fear any round poised on decks like a boast. The gunner learned to trust that a wet chest would keep his future measured in minutes rather than syllables. Hedgerows turned every lane into a throat and every turn into a flue. There the silhouette's height whispered its own half-accusations. A machine that let eyes see over green also invited hands to reach up with theology. Spare track links clanked onto flanks like folk charms. Sandbags rose into crenellations that pleased morale and punished suspensions. And welders scabbed plates over ribs that had once sheltered shells. Ordnance men, allergic to superstition but married to compassion, blessed the extra steel where it covered old sin and scolded the sandbag priest gently. Logs lashed to hulls were not armor at all, only a promise against winter's mud, and yet even they suggested a hunger, anything to buy a second. Second hunger became second nature, and second nature kept men alive. There were days when the myth had no patience to be corrected. A 3-tank troop rolled a Norman lane, 2 in column and 1 offset for fussy protection, and the hedgerow spat 3 shots like a metronome that hated music. One hull brewed because 2 ready rounds sat outside their bins. The second smoldered and lived because lids had turned panic into steam. The third nosed into view like a brother offering his body as a wall and pulled both crews out under a tarp that made its own weather. A farmer would point later at the blackened tree, the scorched road, the shell scar in the house by the lane, and he would remember the flame because it had written color onto a gray day. The numbers would remember something else: 12 hands that kept the discipline of latches, a tarp that smothered oxygen's enthusiasm, a tow cable that turned wreck into repair. Memory is a lens. Survival is a ledger. There is a humility in maintenance that no nickname can touch. In a muddy orchard, an ARV squats like a patient toad and hauls a wounded cousin by degrees while men swear in polyglot friendship. A welder stitches a patch over a scar where shells once lived. An ordnance corporal, face permanent with carbon, replaces gaskets in wet bins with the tenderness that belongs to lullabies. Someone counts rounds into chests and does not stop when he is bored. Someone else removes a map case of canvas because canvas is treacherous when it is frightened. These labors read like footnotes, and footnotes rarely become myths, but they are the margins where the main text is saved from error. Crew culture calcifies into tradition, no loose brass, no loose faith. Bailout drills become a catechism that sets the metronome inside ribs under 5 seconds for daylight, under 7 for night, hatches in sequence, loader last if breath allows, turret traverse to give the driver a miracle. The commander's left hand learns the hatch with the same intimacy as the right learns binoculars. The driver's shin knows the lip it must clear by the feel of boot leather alone. The machine, given permission to keep its innards neat and its lids honest, pays back the favor with seconds that accumulate into lives that accumulate into years. You may prefer heroics. The crews prefer rituals. Across the line, an enemy crew discovered a parallel truth from the other side of the site. A panzer commander, once a poet of ridgelines and angles, now speaks more softly about lanes and hedges, keeps his assault guns as shields, makes his pioneers the authors of survival. He knows that an inside-bursting shell can do what his gun cannot finish. He respects the way a wet rack steals his photographs. He learns to love smoke not as vanity, but as tool, to break the habit of first-shot bravado when a hedge might spit an invisible answer. Myths cross borders slower than methods. Methods travel as quickly as pain. Statements still travel faster than arithmetic. A magazine at home prints a picture of a wreck that bloomed like a black flower and captions it with a nickname that bites easily in the mouth. A mother reads and tastes metal, far away. A loader closes a lid and saves the letter she will receive from ever needing to invent its own mercy. The story of a type will always outrun the story of a behavior, because types take 1 word and behaviors take 6. Yet when the war is done, and the men compare notes in pubs and motor pools, a quieter reputation shows up like an older cousin. This machine always started. This machine took work. This machine forgave. This machine burned when we forgot our manners and smoldered when we remembered. It is tempting to ask for a single verdict the way a courtroom loves a gavel. The field offers a book instead. Early chapters smudge with oil and grief racks in the walls. Dry stowage that made every hit a prosecutor. Hedgerows that let Faust whisper too near. Middle chapters show well lines and new bins. Reduced stowage that angered gunners but pleased widowers. Drills practiced until fear learned its place. Later pages are Den Frost, Rhine crossings. Towns that collapsed in brick and echo carry footnotes about survivable smoke, about engines still running under scorched paint, about a crew that climbed back into a patched hole with a joke so bad it was better than prayer. Myth keeps the first paragraph for itself. Reality insists on the rest. And so the nickname stays, half-earned and fully remembered, useful in storytelling, the way thunder is useful in telling children where to find lightning. But crews know the other name, the one not good enough for headlines, the patient one. The one that turned from fire's accomplice to fire's skeptic, that took water into its heart and kept it there like a promise, that taught men to substitute ritual for romance. If you stand near a museum hull today and lean close, you might smell something faint under the dust solvent. Cordite, iron, water, a mixture of things that argued with flame and often won. The past, properly tended, does not ignite. It instructs. Numbers walk the battlefield after the shouting is done. Boots careful among the blackened ribs of hedgerow and hull. The clerks and analysts move with a different courage, chalk in hand, measuring holes and asking the kind of blunt questions that rifles do not entertain. A penetration here at elbow height, no exit. Ammunition racks burst unknown. Another at the lower side plate. Turret jammed, bins scorched but silent. They circle wrecks with pencils like surgeons diagramming lessons onto an unwilling cadaver. What they find refuses romance. Most deaths of steel are tidy single holes. Crews gone. Little fire. Some deaths are operatic turret gone to the branches of a pear tree. Baskets twisted into calligraphy. dirt vitrified to green. The tall flames that drew a cameraman's eye were rare enough to upset a statistic, but not true enough to explain a war. You peering over their shoulders. Want to grieve by category, the tally refuses it. The winter later redraws even fire's personality. In the Hurtgen dark, smoke clings to ground like a tired animal. Snow swallows sparks. Frost drinks heat until flame loses temper. A hit means concussion first. Cold second. Fire only sometimes. Crews clamber from hulls with faces gray from powder rather than red from heat. And the smell that clings to their coats is the acrid metal of primers, not the sweet loud reek of burning fuel. The nickname feels out of place under a sky that turns breath into ghosts and ghosts into weather. Yet discipline does not slacken. Lids are still lidded. Racks are counted like prayers. A tanker's mitten freezes to a hatch ring and is left there as a warning and a joke. And a loader warns a replacement no loose rounds. No loose anything because winter forgives less even as it burns less. Spring returns with water swollen into rivers that do not respect timetables. And the machines learn to float, or at least to pretend. Duplex drive skirts ripple. Propellers hum with the bravado of fragile promises. Some are swallowed by the cold theater of the surf. And fire has nothing to do with those obituaries. On the far bank, those that make it shrug seawater from engine decks and cross weirs into towns that have already forgotten the faith of hedges. In the narrow streets beyond the Rhine, fire returns in household tones, curtains, cupboards, beams as much a civilian language as a military one. Tanks become shields against that domestic flame, pushing through kitchens that no longer pretend to be private. Hatches cracked for breath. Extinguishers at the ready not for ammunition, but for someone's wall. Engineering has moved the war's hearth, and the crews move with it, wary of the old pantry but fluent now in the new house. The arithmetic of shells grows more intimate. The man at the breech knows the difference between a solid shot that passes like a stern visitor and an HE fuse argument that stays to argue in combustible whispers. He learns to recognize the enemy's punctuation by ear, the flat, sincere thump of an AP that intends nothing but a hole, the crack and lingering mutter of a projectile that carries its own match. He cannot control which grammar arrives, but he controls the paragraph into which it enters lids, latches, discipline as syntax. In a yard behind a Belgian bakery that smells of sawdust and resignation, two tanks sit side by side, one with its turret still centered, interior blackened but intact, the other with plates peeled back like petals. Both were hit. One held its temper because bins held their water. The difference is a sermon too dull for headlines and too necessary to be ignored. Recovery remains the quiet counterpoint. A wrecker loops its chain with the confidence of someone who has rescued stubborn iron since childhood. An ARV crouches and pulls a carcass to the roadside, where a welding set waits like an apothecary. Around them, the small economy of repair continues, gaskets replaced, hoses reclamped, a new lid fitted with a gasket the thickness of conscience. A troop sergeant writes in chalk on a glacis, no loose ammo, no loose rags, no excuses. He is not beloved for the graffiti. He is thanked in other currencies later. The same hall that used to wear a nickname and jokes returns to line with refreshed bins and a superstition that now has numbers behind it. You are asked to see a virtue in monotony the way repetition becomes armor. There are rooms where crews retell everything, and the myth earns its keep because grief prefers a single tree rather than a forest of probabilities. A man will describe how flame filled the turret in a breath, how canvas turned wicked, how the extinguisher fought him as much as the fire. He will forget for a while that another day, in another lane, steam puffed from a lid and nothing more, and that he finished the fight with hands that trembled not from burns, but from having been spared. Memory picks its adjectives according to the heart's need, and the heart has rights that data does not argue with. Still, there is justice in reminding that both rooms exist, the one with black sky and screaming hinges, and the other with scorched paint and the businesslike hiss of water where water ought to be. The war's last months see a machine older and wiser than its nickname would concede. M4A3 shells sleep where they should. M4A1s that had lived rashly wear aluminum patches over the past and keep the present dry. 76mm turrets come with their own rituals. Ready racks remapped, so the fastest round is not also the most treacherous. An ammunition truck parks with its tailgate at a careful angle to minimize the transfer of impatience. A supply corporal counts lids shut with the cheerless zeal of a librarian. And a captain who is tired of writing letters insists on drill until men can escape blindfolded with gloves on and sarcasm in the air. This is not romance. It is maturity. Machines age, and so do their cultures. Beyond the official front, the unofficial one never quits. A crew ties down jerry cans in the wrong place because the road will be long and fuel stations are rumors. And a corporal finds them and shouts until the cans find the right brackets outside, where stupid cannot become fatal. A driver lights an illegal cigarette in the hull, and the smell makes everyone silently furious because no one wants to name the danger in that affection. A commander tapes the sharp edge of a periscope because he has watched panic draw blood at the wrong second. These are small acts of hygiene, invisible from the air, that take a myth and deny it meals. When the war shifts continents and calendars in the same holes meet hills, draped in the cold shawl of another peninsula, the conversation with fire resumes in a new dialect. Winter there eats smoke as Europe did. Shaped charges arrive from different hands. The enemy's shells carry their own mix of steel and intention. The familiar machine, now with better racks as a birthright rather than a retrofit, smolders or does not depending, still and always, on where the pantry sits and whether the lids remember their promises. New crews inherit old drills, and the nickname is mentioned, shrugged at, and filed away half warning, half relic. Neither quite accurate for the present tense. The last arguments belong to those who catalog what cannot be returned to service. In a yard outside a railhead, turrets sit like bowls in the grass, hulls stacked with the stern logic of shipping. Some are black poems and will be melted into plowshares with a hiss that smells faintly of cordite. Others are merely wounded, scorched paint, a warped hatch, a bin lid that did its office and deserves a new gasket. A boy barely old enough to shave runs his palm along a wet rack's rim as if reading Braille. He has told the old story with the old nickname and the new correction with the new tone. Both are true in their hours. He will carry both truths, and one day he will choose which to tell louder. You may still be leaning toward thrift, a single sentence that can be kept in a pocket. The field refuses thrift that cheap. It offers thrift that is earned close the lid. Count the rounds, practice the exit, tie down the world, keep water in the places where heat intends to travel, accept that courage, unguided, is flammable. Then, when the worst arrives with a hiss and an oath, do the work the hands know, and the machine will do part of it with you. In this bargain is where myth comes to heel, and reality takes the lead. At night, the tank's engine ticks as it cools, the sound of labor relaxing into usefulness again. Someone lays a hand on the deck and feels warmth that is not menace, but proof of a heart that worked honestly and now rests. In the dark, bins sweat faintly behind their jackets, a small weather of safety in an iron room. The nickname prowls the edge of the camp like an old storyteller, waiting to be invited. Inside, lids sit closed with modest pride. The flame, that grand jurist, will be in court again tomorrow. The defendants and their advocates sleep with their arguments prepared, in steel and in ritual both. There is a corridor where rumor becomes ritual, and it runs through depots as much as through lanes of combat. In a canvas-walled classroom behind the lines, an ordnance captain holds up 2 cartridges, one dented and smoky from a test rig, the other new and polished like a boast, and speaks in a voice that would be a lullaby if the subject were kinder. Powder, he says, is the difference. Not petrol, not prayers. A shell that is pierced becomes a torch. A shell that stays inside its lidded coffin becomes only heat and fear. He taps the wet chest with a knuckle, and the knock is heavy. Aqueous, convincing in a way diagrams aren't. The loader in the back, knuckles scraped, whispers a private amen, already feeling the cold rim of a lid under his palm in some future alley. You are reminded that the front is only one of the places where war is argued. The rear wins its share of battles with chalk and metal and stubborn pedagogy. Training evolves until it resembles superstition rendered respectable. At first, the bailout drill is a clumsy pantomime, all snagging elbows and swearing. Later, it becomes a dry choreography with no applause, hatches in sequence. Turret toward the safe quarter. Driver clear, bow gunner through the assistant's door, loader last if the air still behaves like air. A sergeant times them with a watch that has heard better jokes and shouts the only compliment that matters again. Extinguishers are fired so often that men dream the taste of their chemicals. No one romanticizes that taste, but everyone remembers it when real smoke arrives. A sign appears in turret interiors in a hand that brooks no debate. Keep lids shut. It is not literature. It is gospel. somewhere along a rail line that breathes coal and impatience. New hulls arrive with the lessons already welded into their bones. Bin jackets are stenciled with small warnings to keep them full. Spare gaskets ride with the ammo crates. A dull expense that buys bright futures. Shops retrofit older machines with plates over the sponsons. Smear weld lines like scars. Stamp inspection marks that mean a man once looked and decided a day would be kinder because of his looking. A corporal with carbon ground into his fingerprint ridges becomes the unlikely author of safety, refusing to release a tank to its crew until lids thud with the right sound. Myth retreats an inch each time the sound is correct. Fear finds new shapes as theatrics change. In a town of brick and shadow, a Faust kisses a Sherman's flank and writes a quick lesson in the language of copper. The flame licks canvas and dies frustrated on steel that withholds tinder. Inside, the loader is already counting 1 for the hatch, 2 for the commander's foot, 3 for the gunner's shoulders, 4 for the driver's miracle, then stops because nothing else is igniting. Steam squeezes past a lid and condenses on eyebrows. The commander's voice, clipped too short to be calm, says, "Hold your posts," and the order is obeyed not because his tone is brave, but because the interior permits it. Outside, a house continues to burn. For once, the tank refuses to imitate the house. The men take that refusal personally and file it under trust. There are failures that need no enemy. A careless rag falls into a space it shouldn't. A battery cable frets its insulation to lace. A cigarette ember betrays the pleasure that created it. Extinguishers earn their keep in these small betrayals, spraying confession into air and onto habit, forcing crews to spit and cough and promise improved behavior. Later that month, the same crew will live through a penetrator that would have written an obituary in 42. They will owe their lives to lids kept closed, bins kept wet, rags kept banished. The machine forgives stupidity if paid in advance with order. Without that payment, myth collects the debt with interest. On the far side of habit, improvisation writes its own catechism. Spare track links dangle like talismans because sometimes superstition accidentally equals reinforcement. Sandbags rise and then are removed when axles complain. Welded plates remain where they protect memory from repetition. In one unit, a superstition becomes policy, no map cases of canvas in the turret. In another, a turret gets a scuffed skillet wired near the ready rack because someone senior once read that Spall hates surprise. Engineers sigh and appliances protest. Somehow, the blend of official wisdom and local folklore produces a survivability that neither could alone. You may frown at the skillet does not care. It sits where it was tied and steals one sliver of velocity on a night when a sliver was all any man could afford. The camera remains treacherous in its preferences. In town squares that will never forget the heat of certain afternoons, photographers record black columns that look like accusations. They rarely capture a crew emerging from a smoldering hull, blinking like miners, because men who have just borrowed seconds do not pose well. They do not record the dull heroism of a recovery vehicle dragging a disgraced tank out from under an enemy's prayer and into a welder's promise. They do not film a lid refusing to lift because its latch has swollen with steam, denying air until malice runs out of breath. Photographs teach a public to fear fire more than concussion, and perhaps that is reasonable, but the ledger continues to grow line by quiet line, arguing that changes in stowage and drill have reduced the number of pictures the camera prefers. There is a psychochemistry to smoke that the manuals do not admit. The first breath of it in a turret forces men into earlier selves. The farm boy who watched a barn's loft go bright, the mechanic who saw a carburetor cough flame, the fatherless son who keeps a hand over a candle to learn something about control. Training intends to interrupt those memories with newer reflexes: latch, kick, shove, sweep, but the heart betrays them all for a beat. In that beat, design must purchase mercy lids that buy time, pathways that make sense in blindness, a hatch whose hinge will not shame its maker under heat. Crew talk in dark humor so their hands will obey instead of their ghosts, and the machine answers with its new grammar: smolder, not bloom. Enemy crews experience the same chemical trial from the other side. A Panther gunner who has felt the hot bees of Spall ricochet through the vestibule of his vision becomes conservative in the exact range where his doctrine begged cockiness. He loves his long velocity, but hates the hedgerow that hoards Fausts. He learns that a Sherman's wet bins steal him the trophy photograph of a blooming hull. He respects the opposing crew's discipline as a problem more than as a virtue. Both sides learn to let fire be less than a myth and more than a hazard, a manageable devil. The field, indifferent. approves of the symmetry. With crossing rivers comes the comedy of water in the wrong places. Bins designed to carry their private moats develop leaks when fragments tattoo them with pinholes. Crews note the drop in weight or the small dark stain that betrays evaporation and fetch the can that smells like every garage on earth. Stenciling that once felt officious, keep filled turns out to be a reasonable hymn. A man with hands like hinges tightens a lid until it gives the right resistance. Later, when a glancing hit peels paint, but not will, the crew will silently thank the sparrows of water hidden behind the metal that did not deign to burn. Not all evidence is mechanical. A chaplain in a field jacket listens to a crew after a close scrape and recognizes that liturgy has been replaced by method. They do not say miracle. They say lid and drill and angle. He does not correct them. The sacrament in this theater is the practice that allowed breath to remain a habit. He blesses the tank without performing words, by running a palm along the warm deck and being grateful for heat that is not hungry. Crews learn to love that warmth, the honest afterglow of engines, tired but loyal, because they have seen its counterfeit in the heat that wants to own the night and all the names in it. A statistician far from gun lines draws lines on paper and discovers that Flame's tyranny has declined as wet racks and discipline spread like a slow, deliberate antidote. He lacks poetry and does not mind. His curve bends where maintenance men had insisted on parts instead of excuses, where officers chose drills over speeches, where crews traded talismans for checklists. He has a number for photographs per 100 losses. It dips. He has another for crews exiting alive from struck hulls. It rises. He knows numbers can lie and lives too deeply to brag. Still, the trend makes him write a letter to a friend that sounds suspiciously like hope. By the time columns hum through towns that pronounce surrender in their masonry, the nickname is only one thread in a larger tapestry. The machine's reputation, once hijacked by a lighter's jingle, shares space with other adjectives: reliable, fixable, forgiving. Fire has not retired, it never does, but it is demoted from fate to factor. Crews who once wore fear like a second uniform now wear habit like armor. They still flinch at the smell that used to decide their day. They still move like men who know a wrong second can erase a family. But they also joke poor jokes at the expense of old myths, because surviving is the only argument that ever convinces. Night settles on a bivouac that smells of iron and onion soup. In the dim-lit interiors, lids sit closed with the smugness of tools that have earned it. The engine ticks and ticks until silence recovers its dignity. Somewhere a letter is written that tells the wrong story because the right one is too long for a page. Somewhere else a loader recounts the rounds in a bin he has already counted twice, because counting is love in a theater where love seldom has time to speak. The Flame sleeps outside the hull tonight, dangerous as weather and, like weather, subject to men who learn where to stand. The tank dozes, dry where it must be dry, wet where it must be wet, and ready, always ready to argue politely with chemistry, come morning. Evening leans against a ruined town and leaves the light on low. In courtyards where pump handles still remember the taste of buckets, tanks settle into the rhythm of engines ticking cool, metal giving small approvals as heat relaxes. Crewmen prop canteen cups on manifolds to coax soup into being, the most domestic kind of alchemy, heat serving instead of hunting. Inside the hulls, lids perspire faintly, a quiet weather of safety, and the water jackets swish when a boot heel knocks a bin by accident. A farmyard sound disguised as doctrine. Fire waits outside the camp tonight like a stray dog that knows where the bones used to be. The men have taught it different manners. New hulls carry their education in the well lines, and the crews feel the difference in their hands. HVSS bogies smooth the tantrums out of bad roads. A kindness paid forward to nerves. The 47-degree nose keeps glances honest. The 76mm T-23 turret gives the loader a choreography that spares him the superstitions of older sponsons. Solid shot favors holes and exits. APHE favors residence and flame. The enemy often sends the latter. It is a strange economy when survival depends on the kind of punctuation your opponent prefers. You, tempted to judge by silhouettes and reputations, are asked to hear the grammar of steel instead. In a city whose cathedral has learned the vocabulary of shrapnel, the argument between flame and order becomes intimate again. Windows burn with domestic colors, curtain, cupboard, cradle, while tanks nose along streets that have the tone of sermons. A Faust coughs from a doorway and licks the paint. An extinguisher answers with its sour breath. A loader coughs twice, spits once, and returns to the work of ramming hope into a breach that has never lied to him. Smoke behaves like a petty politician, demanding attention without offering help. The bins hold their temper, steam beads along gaskets, the crew counts and does not run. The house across the lane collapses with a sigh, and the tank does not imitate it. This refusal feels like a moral victory disguised as engineering. Replacements arrive with posture too straight for the work and eyes that haven't yet learned to narrow in the right way. They have heard the nickname more times than they have seen the machine. Their mothers mailed clippings with black flowers in the captions and instructions for living that no battlefield recognizes. Veterans receive these boys with unromantic kindness and teach them the craft lids first, jokes second, no loose brass, no loose faith, no canvas near flame, count like a miser, bail out drill until the body, not the mind, owns the exit. By the end of a week, the boys carry the machine's real reputation in their wrists, the way a hinge feels when it seals properly, the sound a wet chest makes when you knock it, and the water replies with its heavy amen. The enemy's competence keeps dignity even as it thins. Assault guns angle like readers skimming a dangerous paragraph. Panzer turrets pivot with a restraint that would have offended the summer's arrogance. They discover that the old perfume of a Sherman blooming is rare now. More often there is the businesslike smell of scorched paint and blessed steam. They adjust, as soldiers always do, when myths betray them, and aim for angles and axles instead of theatrics. The duel remains mortal, but its spectacle is demoted. Both sides are craftsmen now. On a bridge that has learned to flinch, a hull takes a long, straight opinion from across the river and shrugs it into sparks. The driver mutters to a patron saint he invented in a ditch last year and checks the lip of the escape hatch with a shin. He trusts more than any manual. Up top, the commander's hand finds the hatch ring without looking, because hands that have practiced find their own named objects in the dark. Nothing else happens. In the old story, this would have been a paragraph of heat. In the new one, it is a sentence about restraint. Later, on the far bank, the same crew will guide an ARV to a cousin hull that smolders instead of burns, and a tarp will turn malice into damp disappointment. The praise is not loud, it is correct. The ledger keeps changing its slope. In field hospitals, where the smell of cordite yields to the antiseptic geometry of gauze, medics notice what statistics had already hinted: more men walk in from struck tanks with eyebrows singed and lungs offended. Fewer are carried in with the deep, separate silence that fire imposes. They learn to wash eyes full of extinguisher chemicals that taste of hell and of second chances. A chaplain, who has developed a habit of blessing machines with his palm, recognizes that the prayer for these men has changed: not deliver us from flame, but thank you for time. There is a brief season when the same hulls wear new guns and new expectations, like hand-me-down suits that fit better than they should. The long barrels speak with a different timbre. The gunner learns a fresh zero. The loader learns new angles inside the turret's small theology. Through all of it, the bins remain the quiet center. Each lid a low door to tomorrow. Crack them only to feed the gun. Close them as if closing a story that does not belong to anyone alive. Men who forget this are corrected by someone who loves them enough to shout. At the edge of a forest-turned notebook by artillery, a platoon pauses beside a wreck from another month-old sponson racks, old secrets, a hole at exactly the height that history prefers. The new crew studies it the way apprentices study a ruined arch, with respect and relief, because the brand has a place to live that is not their present tense. They touch the applique plate welded over a past mistake on their own hull, run fingers along the bead as if reading Braille, and then mount up for a street where ghosts will be spectators again. The dead teach, the living learn without pride. Supply columns deserve sonnets and receive none. An ammunition truck parks at a precise angle to the wind so dust does not invade blessings. A corporal counts lids shut out loud in a voice that could sand wood. He becomes the villain of a moment and the hero of a week. Gaskets arrive in crates that excite nobody and save a dozen names no newspaper will see. The clerk at the depot, cold coffee, colder pen, writes requisitions for water jackets with a zeal that would look religious if anyone bothered to watch. You, who prefer to read heroics in large letters, are asked to accept these small fonts as the script of survival. There is an etiquette to mercy among machines. A hull that smells of smoke parks crosswise to a hedgerow not designed for kindness, offering its side to eyes that might be looking from across the field, converting itself into wall without commentary. Crewmen from the smoldering tank scramble behind that wall, coughing and swearing and alive. And in the exchange, there is an unspoken doctrine today for you, tomorrow for us. Extinguishers change hands the way canteens do. A tarp becomes a shared roof under which oxygen has to ask permission. Later, a cable will loop, metal will thud, an ARV will grunt, and the day will keep its promise, another hull returned to the war, with paint scorched and heart intact. When the line finally spills into country that smells of orchards instead of cordite, the machine's reputation has grown heavier and quieter. It is praised for starting in weather that bullied better pedigrees, for forgiving clumsy hands, for working with infantry as if born to compromise, for not making bad days worse by insisting on turning heat into theater. The nickname persists like a catchy tune from a summer that had too much beer and too little sleep. The crews let the tune play if the civilians need it. Among themselves, they pass around a different refrain. This one gave us time. Night folds into the canvas of the last legger before a river nobody will remember in peacetime. Letters are written with words that avoid the chemistry of survival because mothers do not need to know about gaskets to sleep. Inside turrets, lids sit closed, smug as cats. Someone tells a joke about sandbags, someone else about a skillet wired near a ready rack. Both are ridiculous and both worked, and that is the end of the quarrel. The engine's warmth fades to the temperature of a room you want to stay in. Fire prowls the edge of the map, old, patient, unimpressed. Tomorrow it will attend again. So will water and ritual and the low, unglamorous courage of men who measure their heroes in seconds gained rather than pictures taken. Dawn pulls a thin thread of light through a countryside that has learned the taste of surrender, and the tanks move with a quieter appetite. Bridges whisper under weight, orchards listen without judging, roads remember boots better than tracks now. Inside the steel rooms, ritual persists as if the war were refusing to declare its own ending. The loader touches each lid like a rosary bead. The driver taps the hatch lip with a shin to confirm intimacy. The commander rehearses the reach that translates smoke into decision. Fire has been demoted to a possibility, not a destiny, but possibilities are in their place by repetition, and repetition is the craft that outlives rumor. On the outskirts of a factory town that no longer manufactures much besides rumors, a column halts and a detail peels off toward a yard where enemy hulls sit in a quiet anthology. There is a panther with its nose proud in death, a Panzerfaust whose sponson tells a story with an entry wound the size of certainty, a Sherman from last year still wearing the scaffolding of an old sin sponson racks, now patched with applique like a healed rib. The men who walk among them are not antiques dealers. They are apprentices to consequence. Fingers red weld beads as if reading Braille. A corporal knocks on a wet chest and hears the dull reply that means water has kept its oath. And he smiles the tired smile of a man whose church has finally put its hymn in a key he can sing. Elsewhere, the war keeps teaching by negative space. In a village where a half-shelled church smells of cold incense, a Faust coughs in the alley and licks fresh paint, the kind of close grammar that used to produce paragraphs of heat. Not today. Canvas flares, hydraulic lines flinch. A gasket hisses steam like a tea kettle announcing survival. Inside, the crew does not run because survival is loudest when it is quiet. The gunner returns to his sight as if returning to a book he left open last night. The loader counts without counting and keeps the ready rack a servant rather than a tyrant. The enemy escapes, and the crew lets him go because flame did not make a theater of their moment, and revenge can be left for policy. The ordinary becomes holy. A supply truck arrives late with gaskets and the kind of screws that only seem trivial until a lid refuses to close its promise. A corporal signs for them like a miser counting a dowry. A maintenance sergeant polishes the inside of a hatch ring because he has watched panic draw blood at the wrong second. Men laugh at him, then copy him. A chaplain blesses the entire motor pool by laying both hands on a warm engine deck and saying nothing at all. You may desire poetry. The field insists that this is poetry, merely stripped of rhyme and painted in oil and graphite. On a wooded ridge where the wind speaks a dialect of needles, a platoon pauses and studies an old wreck set back among the trees. Snow has drifted into its wounds and softened their edges. The hole in its side is clean as a syllable in stone. No flame took it. The crew who once belonged to that hole are not here to argue. The new men learn the opposite myth that not every death is a bonfire, not every ending a photograph's feast. Some losses are plain, immediate, particulate. Against those lids and water are irrelevant. The lesson is not despair, but balance fear, the right things in the right order. And the wrong fears will lose their appetite. Memory continues its stubborn negotiations. In billets and canteens, Veterans tell the Black Flower story most often because it keeps listeners awake, and because grief wants a shape it can carry in a pocket. Then, on a night with too much coffee and not enough sleep, someone admits that his worst day ended with steam and coughing rather than with hell. Another nods and adds a detail about a gasket that held and a drill that played like a song in his knuckles. They do not replace the myth. They supplement it, the way a careful engineer adds a plate without removing the original frame. You, listening, are required to learn the same architecture. A true story is a layered construction, not a headline. The enemy's leftovers, sheds of ammo. Crates stamped with a grammar from across the war inherit the same discipline, if only to prevent comedy from becoming tragedy. Ordnance teams enter like librarians reshelving dynamite. The smell is the same in every language: nitro, metal, damp wood, the after sweat of explosions that thought better of themselves. Wet racks trained men to respect powder's hunger, and that reverence travels. A sergeant who once cursed gaskets now refuses to enter a magazine until he hears the right sound of a door sealing. The nickname grows smaller there, in the dark, where careful hands argue against chemistry and usually win. It is tempting to think the machine's reputation ends with the war's signature. But reputations migrate the way rivers do. On a proving ground in peacetime, a hull sits under clean sky while officers in polished boots watch a test round do its measured violence. The hit is academic angle agreed, distance recorded, photograph taken. When the lid on a wet bin lifts its breath as steam and then sits back down like a gentleman accepting that the interruption is over, someone allows himself the smallest satisfaction permitted by science. The notebook records the kind of confirmation that will never make a movie. The next generation will inherit these footnotes as if they were furniture and then forget why the furniture is arranged that way. You must remember for them, posters in recruiting offices will never mention the corrosive, unglamorous love that maintenance represents. They will not show a hand scraping carbon out of a hinge that refuses to seize under heat, or a private learning to hate canvas in a turret, or a corporal smelling the difference between hydraulic oil and complacency. Yet those are the inheritances that cross decades. In another war, under another flag, the same hull shape will nose into a winter skyline with wet racks as an assumption rather than a retrofit. The nickname will arrive as a veteran at the bivouac of conversation, clear its throat, and then be asked to sit down while the checklists speak. There is a museum where schoolchildren slap the side of a green giant without understanding how much shouting those plates have heard. The guide explains the lighter's jingle and the myth like a storybook, and then, if the day is kind, opens a turret lid and lets the echo of water slosh faintly in the belly. The echo is soft, almost impolite. It complicates the laughter that Ronson always provokes. In the bookshop, there is a volume with photographs in love with flame. Next to it, a thinner volume full of numbers and diagrams that don't insist. Buy both, the guide suggests, though few do. We who have walked with this machine through fields and alleys know that truth sits in the space between. If there is an epitaph, it belongs to ritual. Not to courage. Courage is assumed and therefore cheapened when praised, but to the practiced stubbornness that turned fate into factor. Close the lid, count the rounds, tie down the world that might betray you, drill the exit until the body writes its own way out. Keep water where heat intends to travel. Resist superstition unless it proves useful, and then rename it method so that no one forgets why it works. It is not romantic. It is better than romantic. It leaves men alive to be romantic later, in kitchens that smell of coffee instead of cordite. Night gathers like a blanket strangers share. Engines tick their lullaby. Somewhere a man writes a letter without the word fire in it, though the day brought him close enough to taste its old breath. Somewhere else a mechanic tucks a spare gasket into a pocket, because he has learned that even peace needs such objects. The tank breathes its clean, sleepy warmth. The lids sleep with one eye closed, as cats do. The nickname, tired at last, waits outside the wire like weather. The morning will decide which stories deserve to continue. Habit will vote quietly and win. Morning edges over flat fields that have traded shrapnel for seedlings, and the tanks move like old craftsmen returning to a shop they might not need much longer. The air has the clean bite of after rain and mended roofs. Roads are lined with faces that try to smile without counting losses. Steel still weighs what it always weighed, but the burden on the crews feels lighter because habit now carries half. Inside the compartments that once felt like sealed verdicts, there is the measured comfort of a room tidied after a quarrel, rags banished. Canvas exiled, lids obedient, the faint, reassuring slosh where water sits like a quiet partner in an honest marriage. The nickname trails behind in towns and newspapers. Busy with its theater, the machine attends to chores. On the approach to a river with a name that cannot hold all it has seen, a column slows, and an old hull patched in 3 places, its paint a palimpsest of months falls out with a cough. Men circle it without complaint. A mechanic with hands like anvils peels a lid and shakes his head at a gasket that looks tired in a way only use can make. A new ring is pressed in, bolts tightened with the gentleness of a lullaby. The loader knocks once, thud heavy with liquid, and nods. You're asked to hear the difference, the note of promise versus the note of neglect. In those tones lives the distance between headlines written for grief and long, ordinary years earned by diligence. Beyond the river, the distance between stories grows more obvious. A hedge-laced lane holds the wreck of a summer when all was kindling, a turret blown into a pear tree, a hull charred to chalk, the air still obedient to the memory of heat. 50 yards away, a winter wreck sleeps, neat and plain, a hole you could cover with a palm if a palm were iron, snow packed quiet around its edges. Crews pause at both. One teaches fear's shape when tinder and oxygen are friends. The other teaches that concussion and velocity sometimes carry the bill without theatrics. Between them sits the real education that survival is an argument with many clauses, and fire is only one among them. You who came looking for a single verdict to fold in a pocket are required to carry a paragraph instead. A town opens its throat, soft with laundry and uncertain songs, and tanks share streets with prams and bicycles in a choreography that used to be unthinkable. Even here, where civilian windows hold lace and not muzzle flashes, ritual persists. A driver slows at each intersection by habit, counting lines of escape even when no Faust waits. A commander keeps his hand on a hatch ring as a superstition that has become ethics. A loader's palm returns to each lid as if confirming that tomorrow still exists. The ordinariness of caution looks like paranoia until the one day it does not. Ritual keeps the world from finding out which day that was going to be. An enemy gun, forgotten in a hayloft and remembered by accident, barks once on a noon wind. The round bites brick, skips, slaps a hull's flank at an angle that once would have been an obituary. Paint flakes, leather smokes, a canvas strap flares and dies petulant. Inside, men do not trade glances, they trade breaths, then return to work because returning to work is how living continues. The loader rests the base of his neck shell against the cradle without placing it in the breech ready. Not reckless. The gunner rolls his hand on the traverse wheel the way a miller rolls wheat into flour. The commander says, steady, and steady obeys. Lids sweat steam instead of offering kindling. The machine keeps its temper, and so do its tenants. You are shown, in an instant, what months of doctrine purchase temperance under insult. After the brief violence comes its quiet antagonist recovery. An ARV noses past potato sacks and apologetic chickens, lays its cable on a smoldering cousin, and draws it out of sight like a teacher closing a book mid-sentence, because the class has learned enough for today. On the verge, a welder drags a line, inscribes light into metal, sealing a seam that will refuse tomorrow's match. The language of rescue is patient and low grunts. Clicks. The hush of extinguishers working not in panic now, but in housekeeping. No one composes a ballad for the moment. A tarp smothers the last hungry breath inside a turret. Nonetheless, 100 kitchens will come from that small, smelly mercy. A letter arrives in a billet where boots line up like a choir. It carries the cutout article of a rumor's convenient truth, a picture of a black pedal in a Norman lane, and a caption armed with a jingle. The commander folds it along the crease and tucks it into a pocket that will travel with him beyond this season. Later, when a new recruit whispers the nickname as if invoking a weather god, the commander shows him a lid, thumps a bin, points at a gasket, has them drill the exit until their bodies mutter the steps in their sleep. He does not argue with the letter, he outlives it. There is a breed of leadership that prefers numbers to slogans, and it smells of oil and patience. You might think the argument ends when the shooting thins, but habit carries its own momentum. In depots where silence learns to sound like work, an inspector runs fingers along bolts that keep lids down and smiles when the torque speaks the right sentence. In schools where new crewmen meet old hulls, instructors start with the dullest ritual and refuse to move on until it stops being dull. Some cadets will never see flame within arm's reach. Still, their hands will know the lid by weight and promise. The most powerful transcript a war can produce is a generation whose reflexes are wiser than their myths. Stories migrate with the men who survive them. In pubs and union halls, a veteran answers a question with a shrug that declines both glory and apology. Yes, some brewed. Yes, many didn't later. He taps the table twice, as if knocking on a wet chest in memory, and changes the subject to the grace of a welder's puddle, to the way a recovery crew can make a morning kind again, to the howl of a siren on a fire extinguisher that tasted like copper and reprieve. He is generous even to the myth because myth carried friends through nights when numbers were powerless. You, listening, are permitted to keep the myth the way a child keeps a seashell pretty, loud, insufficient. The tide is the real thing. Future wars borrow old hulls and inherit old courtesies. Snow different from Europe's sights on decks. Dust different from Africa's rides in lungs. Shape charges arrive by newer hands with the same ancient theology of copper and speed. The machine behaves according to the same marriage contract. Do the work. Keep water in the right hearts. Never make the pantry a traitor. Train until exits are boring. New crews tape over periscope edges. Banish rags. Drill until a stopwatch is a friend who never lies. The nickname shows up at parties and is tolerated. Checklists show up at dawn and are obeyed. In museums, the dispute continues in glass. One label leans on the lighter's boast. Another sighs the arithmetic of wet stowage and odds. Between them sits the thing itself, enormous and unalarmed, smelling of varnish and dust. A child shrieks when the guide clangs a lid shut and laughs at the echo. An old man flinches as if echoes could still burn. If the day is generous, the docent taps the bin and let listeners hear the dull thud of history's correction. It is not dramatic. It is better than dramatic. It is instructive. There is one last scene the myth never visits because it has too little color. A motor pool at dusk. After action, before sleep. A loader recounts rounds for the third time and touches each lid as if apologizing for inconvenience. A driver wipes a handprint off a hatch ring so panic, if it comes, won't catch. A commander stands on the deck and watches steam rise from a neighboring kitchen and decides that this is the temperature a life should be warm enough to please, cool enough to keep. Fire was never a villain. It was a law. The law remains. The men have learned to be lawyers. You, who came seeking verdict, have been escorted instead through hearings, motions, amendments written in grease on steel and in habit on muscle. The nickname will continue to walk ahead because the world likes a tune it can hum. But what saves, what most often saved, had no tune lid shut. Bins wet, drills owned, superstition demoted to method, numbers obeyed until numbers obeyed back. A tank can still turn into a flower no one wishes to see. Yet more often, in the years after the lesson took, it turned into steam and profanity, coughing men and resumed tasks. That is the quieter miracle, and it belongs to those who made their courage useful. Night rises from the ditches and dissolves in the stars. The last engine ticks into silence, and the lids rest with the feline confidence of tools that know their worth. Fire keeps its ancient camp beyond the hedgerow, old as the first hearth and as moody. Between it and the sleeping crews lies nothing magical, only water, metal, and stubbornness arranged in the right order. The rumor waits for morning to regain its voice. The ritual will be awake before it speaks. Morning returns with a gentler grammar, and yet the field still asks for sentences that mean survival. Dew turns cables into strings of glass. Birds claim the hedges with a democracy that ignores rank. The road glows in thin strips where last night's dew has not yet learned to flee. Tanks wake like oxen honest, heavy, uninterested in theater, while crews resume the liturgy that outlived rumor. Hands lay themselves on lids as if greeting old friends. Knuckles knock the wet chest for the dull reply that sounds like prudence. A driver swings his heel toward the hatch lip to rehearse an exit he hopes to never need. The machine, patient as habit, accepts the attention without protest. It understands what men understand, that luck is a poor hedge against chemistry, and discipline is the only solvent worth its sting. A farmhouse whose roof winks with tin inherits the morning's first negotiation. A civilian steps out carrying a pail and a memory. His voice is a story about a lane that once burned black as a sentence ending, about a turret that flew into his pear tree and frightened the fruit into silence for a season. The crew listens with their eyes and nods with the gravity polite people lend to grief. Then, because decency is also education, the commander taps a bin lid and lets the farmer hear the muffled, watery knock. He shows where the old racks where ribs turn treacherous and where the new ones live, belly turns sanctuary. The farmer doesn't need the diagram. He needs the sound. It changes nothing about the past and everything about the present. Even those not going to war appreciate tools that learn better manners. Rumor, meanwhile, packs its satchel for another audience. In a town square where pigeons hold civic positions, a veteran with the gift of phrasing explains to a circle of curious faces what the nickname felt like pressed against a day. He does not slander his own memory. He simply admits that the melody changed key. Early verses were all tinder and breath. All lanes turned flues. All photographs that taught strangers the wrong arithmetic. Later verses were steam and profanity. Lids that bought seconds and seconds that bought lives. Bins that turned a furnace into a sulk. You, overhearing the recital, recognize the human economy at work. A myth earns trust by arriving fast. A method earns it by arriving every time. In a yard behind a workshop that smells of iron filings and cold tea, an ordnance corporal runs his thumb across the bead of a weld that covers an old sponson sin. The plate feels like a healed rib. Beneath it, the space that used to cradle shells now cradles nothing that wishes to burn. On a bench are gaskets that look as glamorous as shoe soles, and a ledger that might as well be scripture inspection dates. Torquey values, the number of lids that refused until convinced. He has no patience for the nickname. He prefers the quieter insult negligence. Against that he pits bolts, schedules, the dull music of checks repeated until boredom saves a life. Engineers have their own courage, the courage to be uninteresting. A mile up the road, the argument turns technical again. A panther carcass lies with its nose theatrical in death, plates peeled where fire finally found enough to eat. A nearby Panzerfausts looks like a cupboard that never learned to lock. A T-34 rests with a simple, obscene hole and no scorch at all, as if a god had snapped a finger through clay. The crews walk among these lessons with a humility myths do not require. They point at bolt pattern, at angle, at the seam where a Faust's theology of copper unseamed a life. They say words like APHE and APHE and time fuse and traverse jam. And in those syllables lives a truth that reduces slogans to garnish. Fire is not a personality, it is an outcome. And outcomes are fed by storage, by air, by habit. A narrow bridge auditions for disaster and is denied. Midspan. A round from somewhere disinterested smacks the flank of the lead tank like a judge wrapping wood. Paint powders. A strap flares and sulks out. Steam breathes around a lid like a kettle announcing the hour. The crew's bodies move faster than their minds, hatches checked. Extinguisher glanced at. Ready round, not quite seated. Commander's hand still on the ring because tradition says so. Heartbeats counted like old coins. Nothing else ignites. The bridge remembers how to carry. The river keeps its appointments, and the column flows on. Do not praise heroism here. Praise metronomes, latches, and the unshowy genius of water trapped in metal. At a bivouac where onion soup sweetens the evening's arithmetic, replacements receive catechism instead of legend. A sergeant with the patience of winter goes through the drill until the boys stop being boys and become wrists that know the weight of hatches and muscles that know exits by taste. He does not forbid jokes. He bans loose brass and loose rags with the authority of a man who has seen both ignite. He allows superstition only if it has a footnote in physics. A skillet wired near a ready rack earns a smile and a shrug. Sandbags on the nose earn a sigh and a lecture about axles paying for morale's indulgence. He has learned that culture fights chemistry, and culture must be policed. In the chaplain's corner of the world, prayer changes grammar. He no longer asks for fire to be absent. He thanks design and hands when fire arrives and fails to find a home. He anoints lids with a palm darkened by engine grime, which may be the only sacrament machines recognize. The crews tolerate the ritual because it smells like respect. They know the true liturgy lives in the metronome of drill and the obstinacy of maintenance. Still, blessings that acknowledge method feel like accurate theology. You may scoff, the field does not. Across the calendar, the war folds itself like a map, and lessons migrate with the folds. On another peninsula, snow prints its opinion on steel and smoke. Shape charges wear different uniforms in the same appetite. The familiar hull moves according to its old marriage contract. Do the work. Keep the lids honest. Keep the water where heat demands to go. The nickname makes a brief appearance in a tent where men swap histories. It is tolerated like a relative who tells the same anecdote at every holiday. Then the sergeant clears his throat, points at gaskets, and the future inherits something better than a tune, a checklist. Museums perform their double duty in peacetime. A child taps a turret and giggles when the echo returns. An old man winces in a language only his ribs recall. A docent, kindly conspiratorial, invites listeners to knock on a bin and recognize the dull, liquid sound that means engineering made a promise and kept it. In a glass case nearby, a battered lighter sits on a velvet square beside a placard with a jingle printed bold. The juxtaposition is not an argument, it is a syllabus. Take both, the room suggests, but remember which one saved more names. If there is an epilogue written into metal, it appears on later machines with features that look like modest miracles compartments that vent their tempers upward, panels that prefer to fail sacrificially, storage that treats powder like a nervous guest welcome, supervised, never trusted. These are descendants of the wet bin's stubbornness, architecture that learned to escort flame away from lungs and promises. The lesson is not fire defeated, the lesson is fire managed. You impatient for victory, learn to savor governance instead. A veteran stands in a garden and hears a neighbor's grill hiss to life. The smell reaches across decades and brings with it more than summer. He steps closer to the warmer scent and, with a hand that still remembers a hatch ring, adjusts the lid by an inch. There, he says to no one. That's the right draft. The gesture is domestic and absolute. It is the final migration of the war's method into ordinary life managed heat. Don't invite it. Keep the lids you love shut until the right moment. Honor the chemistry that keeps houses houses. Night comes with a weather of forgiveness. Engines tick down to a silence that is less an absence than a well-earned rest. Lids sleep in their frames with the feline arrogance of tools that know they are the difference between rumor and return. Somewhere on the line, a man writes a letter about orchards and rivers and does not spell the nickname. Not because it is false, but because it is finished. Somewhere else. A mechanic slips a spare gasket into a pocket out of reflex. Peace has its own emergencies. The machine, still honest, warms the air above it just enough to remind anyone passing a hand across the deck that fire the enemy, an ally can be persuaded to behave. The rumor will never entirely die. Nothing catchy ever does. But the craft has inherited the morning, and the craft is made of verbs that do not flare close. Count, tighten, drill, knock, listen. The men who carry those verbs forward do not see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as caretakers of a reality that saved their friends. You, who asked whether the lighter song told the whole story, have walked far enough to hear the counter melody. It is quieter. It is steadier. It is the sound of water shifting behind steel, of breath kept, of seconds banked. It is the sound of a future opening. Archives acquire the smell of old paper and machine oil, and under that aroma, reputations harden or soften according to who did the counting. In rooms where the war is translated into tables, a quiet procession of facts insists on its turn. Crews exiting struck hulls more often when water lived around powder. Recovery rates rising when fire arrived as sulk instead of shout. Repairable tanks returning to line with scorched paint and intact hearts. None of this fits on a headline. All of it fits in lives that continued afterward, hands that fixed watches, mouths that learned to choose softer words at kitchen tables, lungs that still disliked the memory of extinguishers but preferred it to the alternative. You may be tempted to distrust columns of numbers because they do not weep. Learn instead to trust what they rescue. The legacy steps forward on new tracks. In the first winters after the Great War, a familiar silhouette finds itself under different stars, ice pinching metal until it sings a brittle note. Korea drags the old machine and its cousins into valleys where smoke lies low and arguments come from ridgelines. There the conversation with fire resumes in a different grammar. VAR strikes blurring the sky, bazookas whispering at indecent ranges, mortars turning snow into steam that smells like flint. Wet racks are not a retrofit now, but a birthright, and crews inherit the habit without remembering who paid for it. A hit writes pain onto steel, lids thud, steam announces survival as if reciting an old poem. Men younger than the myth shrug at the nickname when an older hand mentions it. They prefer the syllabus they have learned by touch: keep the pantry baptized, keep canvas exiled, keep drill honest. The method has outlived the rumor. Design learns to make exits for anger. Early ideas that kept heat indoors are replaced with architectures that invite fury to go elsewhere. Turret blow-off panels become a pact if powder decides to be treacherous. Let the roof, not the lungs, take the insult. Compartments vent up like chimneys that prefer regrets to funerals. You stand beside a later hull and realize that the quiet insistence of wet stowage was a seed. From it grew a family of designs that treat flame as a citizen to be governed, zoned, supervised, taxed rather than a god to be feared. The nobility here is rational, almost bureaucratic, and therefore dependable. Heroism's portrait smiles on museum walls. Governance keeps crews from joining it. Factories that once made the argument in steel now make it in doctrine. Manuals adopt the cadence of carpenters, remove ignition sources, route cables with humility, segregate fuels from tantrums, service extinguishers as if the calendar itself were a hazard. Fire suppression compounds evolve from powders that taste like punishment to gases that steal oxygen's arrogance without stealing human dignity. Even the labels on the bottles grow less hysterical, more literate. A loader in another decade will curse a modern agent's bitter smell and still thank it by living. You impatient for larger gestures must accept that survival is often made of small labels read in the right order. The myth relocates to after hours and stays there. In pubs with low ceilings and varnished memories, a man with weathered knuckles will lean back and, when asked, tell the lighter story the way a fisherman tells of a particular wave. The table will nod not because they believe entirely, but because they respect the animal need to simplify grief into a line. Then, if you linger, the same man will tell an uglier, kinder truth that the worst flame inside a turret is panic, that the lid's thump is the closest thing to a prayer he trusts, that he loved a welder more than he loved any colonel. No one writes that on a poster. Everyone who lived by it keeps a personal altar to the dull god of maintenance. Museums arrange the dialect for strangers. Behind glass sits a cross-section of a wet bin jacket. Lid, gasket, unremarkable as plumbing. Beside it, a photograph of a black flower from a Norman lane. The guide does not ask you to choose. The guide asks you to understand sequence. The photograph happened when the bin did not exist, or when drill betrayed design, or when chemistry outvoted physics. The dull cross-section happened thousands of times when the day refused to become a spectacle. You press your thumb to the plexiglass above the lid and imagine cool water in there. Biding, indifferent. Moral in the way tools can be moral. A child bangs on the hull and laughs because echoes make children honest. An old man flinches because echoes make memory loud. Even language shifts loyalties. Crews speak less of bravery and more of behavior. They trade proverbs about heat for proverbs about order, about the angle of a hatch hinge, about the rhythm of a bailout drill, practiced until the body could leave a room in total darkness with gloves on and contempt for fear. Commanders praise a loader not for daring, but for pedantry, no round outside its coffin. No lid ajar to tempt a devil made of chemistry. Drivers, those interpreters of ground, add a new sense to their repertoire. The imperceptible listing weight that means a bin has leaked and must be refilled, or a promise is being broken silently. The tank itself seems to reward these habits with fewer surprises and more second chances. Across the channel of years, literature catches up. Historians with patience instead of adjectives pry into archives where the clerks lived. Reports written in square, unfriendly handwriting describe how often fire bloomed and why. They give percentages that do not bend to rumor's melody. The curve turns downward as design and drill rise. The curve refuses to reach zero because nothing mortal gets to keep that number. Essays insist that nicknames serve morale in battle and mislead in peace. They rescue nuance from the bonfire, carrying it into classrooms where students who never smelled cordite run fingers down timelines and learn that cause and effect are tender animals, easily startled by slogans. The machine's spirit, if it has one, resides in the handshake between forgiveness and instruction. Forgiveness, the willingness to start on bad mornings, to run on fuel that tasted of compromise, to accept patches over the past and work as if proud anyway. Instruction, the insistence that men become method, that they check the lid and knock the bin and spread the tarp and cut away the rag and hate the loose strap and love the ugly gasket until the gasket loves them back by keeping its oath under insult. You, who hoped for romance or indictment, are left with something less dramatic and more useful a recipe. There comes a homecoming where street lamps replace star shells, and the only fire is the lawful blaze of a foundry pouring plowshares. In a shed behind a quiet house, a veteran opens a toolbox and arranges wrenches with the same care once spent on shells. He teaches a neighbor boy to keep oily rags in a sealed tin, because he remembers how swiftly hunger moves in air. The boy nods without grasping the biography behind the advice. The older man smiles and, as he closes the tin, the small thud is a domestic echo of a lid laid against powder. This is how wars end properly. Their best methods naturalize into habits that make kitchens and shops less likely to mourn. When the last chapter insists on being written, the rumor claws for the pen again. It wants the final word because beginnings and endings are where myths take root. Resist the temptation. End instead with a scene that contains no hero and no headline, a crew at dusk. Unremarkable as furniture, counting rounds into wet chests, clicking latches, winding extinguishers triggers to ready, tapping lids for the dull, wet answer that sounds like a heart content to beat in its sleep. Nothing burns. Nothing explodes. The camera would be bored. The future is being quietly purchased. You have walked beside a name that was easy to remember and a reality that was hard to learn. The nickname will live on because human mouths adore rhythm and sting. The reality will live on because steel, water, and habit insist. When asked at some later date which story was true, you can say with clean conscience the early one hurt, the later one healed. Both belong to the same machine taught by the same men to be better than yesterday. If a verdict is still demanded, offer the only fair one rescued, not from danger, which never retires, but from inevitability, which was the real enemy all along. In the settling dark, a hand lays itself on the warm deck. Beneath it, heat is a servant. Beneath that, water waits with its patient veto. Around both, a ring of latches rests, smug as cats. Somewhere outside the wire, rumor yawns and sharpens its teeth for another audience. Inside, seconds bank quietly like coins in a jar no thief will find. When morning comes, chemistry will arrive to negotiate. Method will be early and unafraid. The weather of memory changes as it matures. What was once a thunderstorm of images becomes a climate of details, the weight of a latch against a palm, the dull reply of a water-jacketed chest, the thin hiss of an extinguisher that always tasted like copper and reprieve. Crews grow older into the kind of men who measure rooms by exits, even in peacetime. Their hands reach for kitchen lids with an unconscious accuracy that embarrasses nobody because it keeps soup on the stove and heat where heat belongs. Children ask for the story with the fireworks and receive instead a liturgy of lids and drills. They look disappointed, then sleep better for not being frightened by a jingle pretending to be truth. On grounds where metal becomes an archive, later designers study cross-sections and write footnotes into armor. Storage migrates into compartments that choose where fury will escape if invited. Panels are taught to sacrificially ascend so that lungs are not asked to learn fire's grammar again. A lineage is traced like a family portrait, wet stowage as stern parent. Blow-off panels as pragmatic heir. Automatic suppression as the child who speaks in clean syllables instead of smoke. The machine family grows less theatrical and more parental. You may miss the drama, the crews miss nothing except friends, and the new architecture spares the next generation a portion of that missing. Training inherits the war's inventions and strips them of romance. In a simulator that smells of plastic and determination, a hatch opens to a screen's counterfeit chaos, and a sergeant counts time out loud 4 seconds. 3, 2 again. Dials register decisions. Checklists become music. Extinguishers hiss without hazard, but with the same insult to throats that memory remembers. A recruit begins the day asking about nicknames and ends it asking about gasket intervals. He will carry both forward, but only one will write his tomorrow if tomorrow is tested. You are reminded that pedagogy is the kindest form of stubbornness. Elsewhere, in the soft geography where metal rests and names endure, graveyards of armor host weather that says nothing untrue. Turrets lie like punctuation across meadows. Hulls slouch toward soil that remembers how to accept everything. Lichen colonizes once hot steel and denies flame its last word. A visitor stops at a wreck whose sponson still exhibits the old sin and kneels to trace the bolt pattern of a plate welded later in apology. The gesture is not reverence, it is reconciliation with design's first draft, with the arrogance that every army initially brings to new chemistry, with the patience that made second drafts worth fighting in. In attics, boxes of photographs argue with ledgers. The pictures want to retell flame, the notebooks ask to count. A family sifts both and discovers that history is a partnership between image and integer. There is a print of a black flower in a Norman lane, tragic and excellent at persuading emotion. Beside it, a line from a unit, return crew, bailed. Hull smoldered, recovered, returned to service after patching bin lid, gaskets replaced. The juxtaposition is an education that refuses melodrama without insulting grief. You, reading over their shoulders. Learn the discipline of holding two true things without letting either lie about the other. The enemy's archives, translated with care and a humility earned late, corroborate the same correction. Reports from gun lines admire the Sherman's habit of refusing to bloom after 44. Notes from assault gun crews complain that their photographs became less impressive and their claims less persuasive once water moved into the belly of the opposition. There is a cold, professional respect across the old divide, craftsmen recognizing an improvement in another shop and adjusting their own methods accordingly. Enemies share more with each other in this truth than with civilians who love nicknames and dislike decimals. Cinema arrives and does what it always does, lends thunder to what was already loud and silence to what deserves attention. Films savor the column of flame because film loves contrast. It cannot easily love a lid that holds or a crew that coughs and returns to work. Yet occasionally, because a veteran whispered during production or a consultant insisted during editing, a scene is allowed in which steam beads on a gasket while the men inside count breath instead of lines. You are asked to notice the rare honesty and to forgive the rest as theater that helps the uninitiated approach the threshold of comprehension without crossing it. Textbooks eventually write the verdict in small type. Early stowage fostered fires. Later stowage, training, and field modifications reduced them sharply. Survivability improved in proportion to boredom enforced. The chapter is short because the truth is not flamboyant. Students who expect romance feel cheated until they meet someone who slept through a decade because a lid did its job and a checklist was obeyed. The craft of living beats the art of losing beautifully. It always will. In workshops that outlast the war, jokes become procedures. A skillet wired near a ready rack, graduates from folklore to footnote tested, adopted where useful, retired where it interfered. Spare track links become standard in some places, cautionary in others. Sandbags, accused by axles, are allowed at parades and forbidden in fights. The mythology of quick fixes is filtered by the sieve of physics and logistics until only the parts with numbers attached survive. There is dignity in letting superstition audition and then either join the cast or leave the stage. The ethical shadow of survivability stretches into unexpected rooms. If a tank burns less, crews live more, and armies learn that the expensive materials of training time, trust, cohesion can compound. Men who survive a smolder write better letters than those who don't. Units with fewer funerals retain the soft virtues, humor, patience, a propensity toward kindness that do not win battles, but change how they are remembered by the civilians who inherit the streets afterward. You are invited to see engineering not as sterile cleverness, but as a moral choice. To escort heat away from breath is to vote for future kitchens and schoolyards over perfect photographs. There is, too, a geography of smell that never entirely leaves the men who were tenants of steel. Cordite, oil, hot paint. The sour insult of extinguisher compounds. Each odor is a key to a door they do not always wish to open. They manage the doors with rituals. Some keep a spare gasket on a garage shelf for no reason that need be spoken. Some refuse to store rags outside sealed tins as if the house were a turret. Some adjust the lid on a backyard grill with exactness that makes the neighbor smile and not understand. Domesticity becomes the last theater where the method plays its quiet, triumphant encore. Statistics continue to be kept in peacetime because numbers are the only biographies that do not forget. Accident reports from training grounds testify that lids remain shut more often than not, that drills still subtract seconds from mistakes, that extinguishers are serviced on time by men who never met the origin myth and yet obey its antidote. An officer signs off on a maintenance schedule with a pen that has never smelled fear, and the pen does not need to. Obedience to boredom is its own courage. You, who once doubted the heroism of monotony, begin to honor it with the sincerity it deserves. The last museum of this campaign is a place without walls, a memory practiced until it becomes reflex rather than recollection. A crew, now old, reunites and mouths the steps for a bailout in an empty park for the kind of laugh that makes knees ache and ghosts relax. They time themselves with a watch that has outlived batteries and now keeps a metaphysical minute. They are slower. They still finish within the private standard they set during a year when seconds were coins. The audience is a grandchild who thinks it is a game. It is. Games are how cultures train memory to survive its own fading. When public ceremonies summon the machine for display, paint glows, tracks are black with dignity, and hatches open to let sunlight do the tourist's work. Guides tell the lighter's story because it is a door. But if a visitor lingers, the guide knocks the bin with practiced knuckles and lets the dull, wet sound revise the tale. In that small percussion lives an essay about design's repentance and discipline's triumph. The listener who hears it hears something kinder than myth and sterner than nostalgia, a promise kept. Beyond all interpretation stands the field itself, purified of drama by seasons. The lanes where hedgerows once turned oxygen into conspiracy now grow wheat that burns only when farmers ask it to. The rivers that cooled steaming lids move under bridges that no longer shudder. The orchards where turrets once nested like obscene birds now recover the ordinary, making fruit heavy enough to break branches in storms. Fire remains in stoves and forges. The tools that kept it there still exist, uncelebrated, in every kitchen drawer and motor pool lids that fit. Latches that close. Water where it ought to live. What finally becomes of a nickname? It earns a shelf beside other souvenirs useful once in rallying courage. Inaccurate as a map, instructive as a caution against swallowing headlines with your supper. The real inheritance is blunter and more beautiful, the craft that taught steel and men to negotiate with heat instead of dramatizing it. You, who demanded to know whether the rumor was verdict, have walked through the rooms where verdicts are denied by inches and seconds. The rumor will always have an audience. The inches and seconds will always have a future. Night comes. Warmer now, smelling of cut grass rather than cables. Engines tick themselves quiet. Lids sit with their smug feline certainty. Extinguishers linger in brackets like old soldiers at the back of a parade, respected, unassuming, ready to be rude if the world grows rude again. Somewhere a veteran slides a gasket into a pocket he will likely never need. Somewhere a mechanic wipes a hinge because hinges that close easily are better prayers than most. Fire waits in its lawful places. The tank sleeps in the ease it earned. Morning will wake both, and order not rumor will decide how they speak to one another. Morning does not ask permission anymore. It arrives and the world obeys. In a depot yard where grass has started to argue with gravel, a tank idles for a final inspection. Its breath steady, its warmth benevolent. The men around it move with the economy of those who have paid for each gesture in another currency. A loader taps each lid and hears the familiar dull reply of captive water. The sound is less a check than a farewell. A driver, who once measured fear through a clutch, swings his heel against the hatch lip in a private benediction. The hinge answers without complaint. The commander leans one palm on the engine deck and feels heat that belongs to labor, not to loss. You standing at the edge of this quiet choreography are confronted with an anticlimax so humane it feels like victory. Nothing burns. Beyond the fence, a town arranges itself for markets and marriages. Windows open like lungs. Kettles answer with their lawful steam. A black cat crosses a courtyard with the insolence reserved for the unscarred. This, too, is an inheritance of lids and latches. The fame of the lighter's jingle remains, ready for conversation in barber chairs and parlors. But its sovereignty has lapsed. The better story is 1,000 smaller ones, a gasket fitted on a gray morning. A drill repeated until pride gave way to competence. A tarp thrown over a turret like a tent against oxygen's ambition. A recovery cable paying out with the patience of a psalm. Fire did not disappear. It stayed and learned manners. A last patrol through memory reaches places rumor never bothered to visit. A ditch at dusk hosts the awkward dignity of men, coughing extinguisher bitterness and continuing without ceremony. A winter lane shows a hole so precise it could be mistaken for punctuation, a death without theater. The sort that reminds survivors that chemistry does not owe any audience a spectacle. A farmer's pear tree, once decorated with an impossible turret, now bends under fruit again. Children learn to climb by logic rather than legend, and only hear the older story when the evening asks for a ghost. In each scene, the same hinge turns design corrected by humility, behavior corrected by repetition. You are asked to honor the hinge rather than the door. There remains the question of fairness to names. Sherman Ronson is fleet on the tongue, an inheritance of gallows humor that concealed terror and kept hands from shaking while fingers sought latches. It is not a lie. It is a partial oath sworn under pressure. The fuller oath includes the wet bin's secular sacrament, the apology plates welded over old sins, the engineer's unromantic courage in admitting that yesterday can be improved without insulting the dead. The crews made a covenant with the machine, and the machine with its forgiving crankshaft and democratic tolerances kept its half-start on bad mornings. Survive insult without becoming theater. Accept repairs like compliments rather than lectures. Where rumor promised spectacle, the Covenant delivered time. Time paid dividends beyond battle. Men who did not burn carried habits into rooms that expected none. A garage became a small republic of order, oily rags in a sealed tin, extinguisher and date, latches taught to close with dignity. A kitchen became a negotiated peace with heat, a lid adjusted by an inch for the right draft. A child warned about curiosity without being taught to fear the stove. In these transplants of method lives the most subversive victory war's best inventions, refusing to remain martial. You may prefer triumphal arches. The crews prefer hinges that never stick. The archives, those quiet judges, continue their deliberations in stacked boxes and microfilm's gray weather. Tables that look like sleep to the uninitiated hum, with moral content, survivability curves, bending as if under a reasonable wind. Repairable returns rising in a slope that meant men returned to jokes, to bad cigarettes, to letters signed with fatigue rather than silence. Historians with patience write sentences that do not fit on monuments, ignition sources reduced, ammunition relocated, crew training standardized, post-penetration fires decreased significantly in later production and post-modification vehicles. There is no thunder in such language, only shelter. Shelter is better. Across the old frontiers, the enemy's notebooks learn parallel grammar. Assault gun crews write with wounded decorum that their trophy photographs grew rarer. They note that the opposition's discipline complicated claims. They adopt their own rituals, becoming, through the medium of respect, kin. The symmetry feels like justice, two crafts converging on the same conclusion that bravery unguided is fuel. On some late-field Poland, the Palatinate, the edge of a city whose name is now pleasant to pronounce and 88 positions carefully. A Sherman angles deliberately, and the quarrel, stripped of rumor, becomes a contest between timing and ethics. The shells still bite, the lids still answer. Lives continue to pivot on inches and seconds, but the seconds are more often banked than stolen. Exhibits do their best to translate. A docent knocks the wet chest and waits for visitors to hear the correct thud. Children grin at the echo without understanding its mercy. An old man grips the rail as if sound could still travel backward. Beside the hull, a lighter gleams behind glass with captions that cannot quite domesticate it. On the opposite wall, a cross-section of the rack sits modest as plumbing. The museum's true genius is refusing to pick a side. It lets the two artifacts glare at each other across a room and trust that adults can hold two truths in one mind: the early hurt, the later healing. You, moved by such literacy, realize that maturity is the only respectful ending any war can claim. One last convoy climbs a road that no longer expects ambush, passing hedgerows that have made peace with their own shadows. At the crest, the land opens in a page of fields and roofs. Engines idle. A commander stands, not to scan for threats, but to locate a steeple he once used as an azimuth, and now counts as a promise kept. He touches the hatch ring with an affection that embarrasses even him. Below, the loader leans against a lidded bin and listens to the small tide inside. The sound, ridiculous and solemn, might be the war's true anthem. The driver, hands relaxed on levers that no longer threaten to betray him, thinks of nothing profound, which is itself a profound relief. They are craftsmen at the end of a long job, and the shop is finally quieting. If a verdict must be written, let it be plain. The nickname was a fair fright in an early chapter and an unfair history by the last. Fire was never sentimental and never will be. It arrived according to design, distance, and luck. And it was persuaded, not commanded, to leave by lids, water, and drills. The tank did not become saintly, it became better. Men did not become invulnerable, they became methodical. Between those improvements, 1,000 unphotographed lives fit, and every one of them argues against the laziness of a jingle. You, who have walked the length of this argument, may keep the nickname as a souvenir if you also keep the sound of a knuckle on a wet bin as its correction. Evening lays down, wide and forgiving. In the last logger, engines tick their lullaby into the soft overcast. Extinguishers sit in brackets with the look of veterans at a reunion, useful if needed. Content to be ignored. Lids sleep in their frames, smug as cats, answering to no one but the hand that set them. Somewhere beyond the wire, rumor sharpens its teeth for another telling. Inside, habit arranges the night canvas away from heat, rags sealed, lids latched. A final knock that sounds like fate rewritten into policy. The fox of dawn will come again, and with it the old negotiations of steel and chemistry. The men are ready. The machine is ready. Fire remains, ancient and honorable, waiting for its lawful work. Order, the human invention at the core of every salvation, will meet it at the door.